Can you remember the first time that you met Jacinda Ardern, and when was that?
Yeah, I think I wasn't in Parliament yet. So I think I was on the New Zealand Council of the Labour Party. Jacinda was a staffer in Helen Clark's office by that time. And I just met her through a Labour Party event or Labour Party events. My old colleague Paul Tollett, who was his own branch of the Labour Party just about, he introduced me to her and was very fulsome in his praise of her.
When you sort of met her for the first time, were you like, wow, she's going to go somewhere? Or was it sort of like instant, she could be leader, she could be Prime Minister, or is it hard to tell?
It was hard to tell then. I mean, she was incredibly likeable personality. And to be honest, I can't remember the sort of things we would have talked about. It was pretty, it was an introductory sort of thing. So, but she had a personality that certainly stood out.
So you noticed that there was not a star power, but you noticed that she had something.
Yeah. And then when she'd be doing those things. David Shearer retires, steps out of Mount Albert. And we had a by-election there. So she had that campaign. I did what I did to support her, and then she got that result, which was very good. I think Jacinda clearly had very strong cut through. And we made the decision then that and because it was easy to do so, we would work closely together. And in terms of my kind of outreach from 2017, we did a lot together in terms of public platforms.
So was that the moment that you thought at the Mount Albert by-election, were you like, she needs to be deputy leader? Is that how that came up?
Yeah, I think that was a compelling reason for it. I think we had to think about our look going into the 2017 election, bearing in mind that the National Party had Bill English and Paula Bennett, and we needed to think about our look. And Annette was, she's a very long-standing senior caucus member. I think she was thinking about what next for her, and there was a natural point where everybody was very comfortable with the change, and Jacinda stepping up.
Because Jacinda's quoted as saying that she felt really uneasy and quite awkward about replacing her good friend Annette.
That's not at all surprising. Jacinda's nature is that she is very much a team player, and she wants to and does form good collegial relationships. And so doing something that looks like you're stepping on somebody who's been a good colleague and a big supporter of you is naturally uncomfortable. But equally, she's capable of, and she did, she does in the end, see actually the political calculus is just as important. And
so you did make those changes. How did it go from that to her being the leader?
Well, as we get, and the whole thing that, particularly in an election year, the closer you get to an election, you do expect to see the polls firming up, and actually by the middle of that year they started going in the other direction. And it wasn't just one poll, it was several polls. And certainly I had made the mental note that if we weren't getting into the healthy early 30s and mid 30s in polling, then I had to think very hard about what was needed. It was very clear in the joint events that we did together, Jacinda was kind of an electrifying presence. We were both doing a visit to Weta workshops, and we were just about to start the presentation, and the text message came through, and the latest polling result came through, and it completely, a bit of a gut punch for me. Anyway, we both sat there, and I think she must have got the same message. We both sat through the presentation, and we were professional. We got back in the car and travelled together. And I just said that first thing. I said, look, that's not a good thing. So we got back to the office, and I talked to her. I said, look, I've got to really think seriously. We have to think really seriously about what happens next. And I said, I have to think about what I do. And if I'm not the right person, then you're the next obvious one. Now, she was deeply resistant to any change, and she was very urging me to say, no, you know, see this through. And then on the Monday, I made the decision that I thought, given that in the polling that the spiral was too far down, that I should step aside, and on the basis that Jacinda would step up.
How hard was it to make that call for you personally?
The ultimate is to get your team, particularly in politics and in government, you've got to get your team into government in place. And I just concluded that I wasn't going to be the one to be able to deliver that, and Jacinda had a better chance. But you know, I certainly stand by that decision.
And what was that caucus meeting like on the 1st of August?
I think there was a sense of relief, and like no one wants long drawn out bitter things. Labor had been good at that in the past, but I think there was a reality too, and I accepted the reality, and supported Jacinda, and I nominated Jacinda to be the leader. It was all done.
And when did you realise you made the right call?
Oh, you know, I was confident then, but I think certainly when you saw the polling results, the snap polls and the days that followed, when the numbers just took off. And I think the feedback from people too suggested it was the right thing.
When did you first see Jacinda Mania, the hype and out in public?
Oh, I think probably the first thing I saw was a Facebook post by Greg O'Connor ripping down the hoarding with my face on it and putting Jacinda's one up. So, and Greg was totally said, you know, I think the slogan, his caption was, you know, out with the old and with the new.
Brutal.
So, brutal, but... so, and I think that when Greg O'Connor is doing that sort of stuff on social media, you know that that's had an impact.
I mean, no one wins election night, but the polling had gone from kind of 24%, I think, under you guys as a team,
yeah.
And I think it was 37 or 38% percent on election night.
Yeah, so no, I felt very pleased and very proud of Jacinda. You know, that was tough too, in spite of all the things about, you know, my confidence in her and no doubt confidence in many others. She had to step up and get engaged in a campaign to a level and a great degree that, you know, at the end of July she was not expecting at all. And she did it, and she did it amazingly, and got that result. That was totally a reflection of her impact and her reach and her communication skills and her political judgment.
And then they got into negotiations. Winston chooses Labor. Did you have an inkling that he'd go that way?
I think he was conscious of the mood for a change. I think he was never a great fan of John Key's, and although John Key wasn't there at the time, I think he still felt bruised by some of the things that then national ministers had said and done. You know, I think in his typical way, he weighed up the various options, and look, he went with us. I do know for a fact, because I remember talking to Jacinda in the days leading up to Winston's announcement, she was finding it very frustrating, and she thought she'd done everything she could to lay out the case for him to go with Labor, and it was just taking him a long time to make a decision. And then we all sat with bated breath at the live broadcast of his decision.
Yes. What was she like as Prime Minister in that first term?
I mean, no disrespect to Winston and his party. The challenge always was that part of the relationship. Jacinda has got, I mean, amongst her many qualities as well, extraordinary patience. And I think, although I wasn't there for them, but my read on it is that on some of the really difficult issues, particularly the issues on climate change policy and what have you, they were very challenging discussions to have with New Zealand First, but she had them and engaged with them. There were some things New Zealand First just said no to, and we just had to live with that. Other stuff that they tolerated or grudgingly accepted. But I know that she spent a lot of time and energy in that relationship.
Looking back, it must be like quite remarkable that you made it work. How did you do it?
I think the other thing too is the New Zealand First had some really good ministers. I mean, the ones I worked most closely with were Ron Mark and Tracy Martin. Even Shane Jones to some extent. Shane was incredibly supportive in my role as Treaty Negotiations Minister. He was always a good go-to person, testing the boundaries of, what Crown could or should agree with. He was very supportive. And in terms of my own personal relationship, particularly with Winston, again, on the treaty stuff, and particularly trying to get things over the line with Ngāpuhi, he was very supportive of that, very helpful on that. And a couple of other things we had to engage on. Look, he was always good to engage with. Sometimes he would take his time to make his mind up, and once he did, he was quite decisive. The one thing he let me down on was the 3 strikes legislation. We'd committed to repealing that. He personally contacted me, we personally spoke about that, and he personally committed to me that he would support its repeal and that he would ensure the New Zealand First Caucus did. He clearly got rolled in that caucus, and they backed out of it, and so that didn't change in that first term.
Jacinda Ardern's pregnancy, it was like a royal baby.
Yeah.
What was it like for you as a cabinet minister, watching everyone just sort of go gaga over this?
I think for those of us in cabinet, particularly Labor cabinet ministers, it was more about making sure Jacinda was okay. Not only was she about to be a mum, she was also the Prime Minister, and she was kind of freshly a Prime Minister. And look, the reality is, you still got to learn the ropes of that job. March
15, 2019, a date that you'll remember forever. But you were with Ardern in Taranaki,
right.
Your tūranga waiwai. Were you with her when, were you in the van together going,
Yes,
I think, to an environmental school or something like that?
That's right.
When the calls came through, your press set called her press set called her.
I got a call. She got a call, and I think her press secretary had moved up the van to talk to her, and I could see that she was very deep in conversation. And then I got a call, and it was actually Rebecca Kitteridge, of the SAS, who
Okay. Yeah.
told me, and that was very early days. I think at that point Rebecca said, we think there are 1 or 2 fatalities. That was what they understood at the time. But she did say it looks like a terrorist attack. So we knew that much at that time. So from there, yeah, and then just turned around, headed back to the New Plymouth police station, and we just had her dropped off, and then she kind of just took over from there. So she was there to open WOMAD actually, so I went and did that for her that evening. By that time I was getting regular reports from the agencies, and they needed authority to do various things that evening.
That was essentially the first big test of her leadership, wasn't it? What she did there. How do you think she went?
Well, it was amazing because it was, within an hour or two of first being told, she gave the first press conference in New Plymouth, where she used those, the memorable phrase, they are us. And that became very much symbolised, her approach to it, that this was an attack not just on a particular community, but on all of us. And that was the approach she took. It was very inclusive. It didn't treat those who were worshipping at a mosque weren't treated as others. They were treated as all of us, and which very much defines Jacinda's view of the world, I think. Because she is naturally empathetic, and she has a humility too about her, which means that I think it's easy for her to think, what are those, if I were in their shoes, what is it that would give me assurance or comfort? She's very thoughtful about what she does. And that's why she's so good at that. And yeah, that's why she was so good on that occasion and many others since, because that is her, that is naturally her. And I think that's the thing too about a lot of her engagement over that time was, you could tell that she, challenging as that might have been emotionally, she was capable of doing it and made it look effortless, even though I know it was, it took a lot of her emotional energy as well.
And then, a few months later, down in off the coast of Bay of Plenty, Whakaari White Island, the eruption there, and 22 tourists dead, 25 injured.
And she went up there. She went up to Whakatane and Tauranga and interacted with some of the victims of it. Yeah, and I think she was aware too, a lot of international travellers there who were affected, people off the cruise ship, so she was aware that news would go further and wider, and it was about demonstrating that New Zealand was able to respond in an empathetic sort of way.
Then we get to 2020, January and February, the global pandemic where everything changed.
I think by the end of January we knew that this was a big deal. I remember I was actually had gone to a friend's 50th birthday party in Auckland on the Saturday evening, at the very end of the month. And that after, only a few hours before, got messages, emergency cabinet meeting, dial and all the rest of it. So 8 o'clock that night, I'm stepping out of the 50th birthday party. I couldn't stand on the balcony because everybody else, it's a beautiful summer evening. So I found had to go onto the street, found this little empty park area
Wow.
to do this call. So that was, that was the point at which I think the US had blocked travel to the US from China. And of course we were being prevailed upon to think about the same sort of measures. So that was the first of it.
Then you made the bold decision to close the borders.
Yeah.
And it was a very popular decision initially.
Yeah, it didn't happen quickly, obviously, and everybody had to think through all the implications, and particularly the economic implications. I think Stuart Nash was excellent about giving us an understanding about what the impact would be, and Shane Jones is the regional development minister too, I think. So we certainly got an understanding about that. I think for Grant Robertson, obviously as finance minister, he was concerned about economic impact. It was a big call to make, and it wasn't, closing the borders was just the start of it. It was what you do after, and to support people and businesses to get through what was going to be a very disruptive time.
And you did. Businesses were supported, and the economy in New Zealand was going quite well, and it was the envy of the world for a long time, for most of the rest of that year.
By the middle of the year, we'd developed the traffic light system, and they were sort of in and out of various stages of lockdown. I think that was the challenge, was that there was always going to be a limit. We always expected there'd be a limit at which New Zealanders would say we've had enough. I think while a vaccine was being developed too, we had a bit of leeway to embark on the harsh kind of responses. I think once people were aware that there was a vaccine, at least most people, they expected to see that.
And you had an election in the middle of that, 2020.
That's right.
And the opposition was kind of imploding as well, as I guess you'll sympathise with that because you've been part of what happened with Labour.
Oh, you never feel sorry for your political opponents. But that, it's kind of, sometimes a caucus just has to go through what it has to go through. And they would be concerned about what they were seeing, their polling. I think the reality is, in the face of the pandemic and seeing what was happening around the rest of the world, New Zealanders, the vast majority, were satisfied with the way the government responded and rewarded us at the ballot box for that. And it probably didn't matter what National did. Them doing what they did and the changes of leader looked self-indulgent, I think, at the time when there was this major national crisis. And I think that probably didn't help them.
And you got a majority. That was, an absolute landslide. I don't know if we'll ever see that again in the MMP.
First time since MMP, and so we'll see. I think that was a surprise, and I think there was also a little bit of, fear is the wrong word. I think we were thinking, well, that actually puts a lot of responsibility on us, in a sense, to not be our own opposition, but to be able to have challenging conversations, even though we have an absolute majority in Parliament.
When did you start to notice people going, hang on, we're a bit over this now?
Yeah, I think what changed, the mood changed during 2021 and changed particularly in Auckland. Auckland had a lot more lockdowns, even though they were kind of level 3 as opposed to level 4 lockdowns, a lot more constraints there. I think by that time too, leading up to that, there were the constraints on movement in and out of Auckland, and I think people felt hemmed in by that. I think also those what looked like very draconian measures, and they were constraints on people's freedom. We weren't used to that. We'd never seen anything like that. And then there was an audience of people who, largely drawn from stuff online, mounted their own kind of online campaigns about it. I don't criticise anybody for challenging the constraints, but I think there was a lot of the online discourse fueled this sort of anger and resentment. There was a real sense of anxiety and frustration by them. I remember somebody saying to me, who I've known a long time, and they've got very good instincts. She said to me, this is be the end of 2021. She said, look, you guys have lost Auckland. And it turned out to be right. I mean, it became apparent. A lot of New Zealanders were concerned about and upset about is the managed isolation and quarantine regime that we had in place. And people who wanted to return to New Zealand were in a queue, and it was all kind of by lottery, and people couldn't get back. And then, I'll say now that internally, I was very concerned about that the applications for kind of a compassionate approach in individual cases. I didn't see much evidence of compassion, and I was concerned about that. I remember, in terms of people getting exceptions from being vaccinated. I won't go into all the details, might end up identifying them, but I just thought it was completely ridiculous that they couldn't get an exemption. So I wrote to Ashley Bloomfield and said, I don't understand this, and what's the story here? And he came back to me, and I said, well, I still don't understand, so I'm going to specifically request that they be given an exemption, and they still didn't get it. I just think so. I think people saw, in addition to everything else that was going on and restrictions of freedom, they also saw that in some of the aspects of the way we approached the pandemic, we lacked a compassion that we could have exhibited.
Can't say you're compassionate, kind government when you're not.
Yeah, I think that we're balancing up there that individual compassion and the need to protect everybody. And at some point, certainly as 2021 wore on, and certainly towards the end of the year when we're reaching the 90% vaccination target, the settings were really not changed. Whereas we could have done more in the compassionate space, we continued as if it wasn't needed. And I think that, I certainly think that's something that bears examination. We did a lot of stuff to prime the economy, to kind of get the stimulus going. And I think it was overdone. I think the economy bounced back more quickly than we had expected. And that then fueled inflation. And so that then became its own problem. We weren't alone in that. Plenty of other countries and economies had the same experience. But it's that, getting that balance right. I remember 2020, 21, the number of business people who said, thank God you did what you did. My business would not have survived without the support that we had. But who were the same people in 2022 saying, we've had enough, we've just had enough. And it was always going to be a very difficult balancing exercise.
The 23-day occupation at Parliament.
Yeah.
I mean, the scenes you saw there, totally unprecedented. What was that like being in government, seeing that out on your front doorstep and the streets around it?
Yeah, I think eventually it just got exasperating. I mean, respect for, of course, people have got to come to Parliament and protest. And of course, when people feel their freedoms are being constrained and compromised and stuff, of course there should be a noise about that, and there was. But I think eventually that the occupation kind of became something more than that. I mean, you know, things didn't help. I don't think Trevor turning on the sprinkler system was a particularly
And the Barry Manilow
useful
music.
way to diffuse things. Anyway, I think it became, and it did become very bitter and angry. And like and the security threat was pretty serious. You know, we were being advised of, like, you know, when you're a minister, particularly ministers of certain portfolios, you expect various levels of antagonism and threats and stuff. But they were getting quite serious. I mean, there was one time when the police told me, like, there is this threat. And unfortunately, we can't provide security. Our advice is to get out of town for the night. So we had to do that. There's no question that some of it was unhinged. I remember hearing some of the speeches by people, by health professionals, nurses, who would stand up and talk about the vaccine, and it was what they said was just totally untruthful. But they said it, and they said it with confidence, and people believed it. I think it is that thing about when people are, you know, the lives are disrupted, and because of government, and their liberties are constrained. There are some people for whom that is very distressing, and they are very vulnerable. And I think that feeling distressed by that is totally understandable. But for people seeing that and to exploit it with disinformation and misinformation, I just think is it's unforgivable, but sadly it does seem to be the way of the world these days.
That year you were, as a government, doing a lot of other things as well, the merger of TVNZ and RNZ, there was Three Waters, there was light rail, trying to get that going, because these are things that kind of stalled or you know, weren't being rolled out. There was fair pay agreements and tax reforms and universal income insurance and things like that. Was it just a case that there was just too much reform?
Yeah, I think that was. I think I recall during 2022 Jacinda saying that there was a lot going on. She was concerned about how much was going on. I think the water reforms had got bogged down. I think, and there was the sort of a campaign about co-governance on the back of it had taken off, and we struggled, I think, to manage a lot of that. I mean, one of the criticisms I would have around that time, 2022, 2023, is particularly when all the issues about co-governance and the relationship between Crown and Māori were sort of taken off, is that the government was largely absent from that debate, and we actually should have been in it. But anyway, we weren't. But I think it derailed the water reforms quite significantly.
Did you have an inkling that she would come back and resign?
Certainly didn't think that. I mean, I think we all were aware that by the end of 2022, she was just exhausted. She was just exhausted, and you could, you know, and so we were all saying, you need a decent break, you know, have a decent sort of summer break. But it was certainly a shock when she came back and announced she was retiring. So
you didn't have an inkling? You went to that caucus retreat thinking, great, let's go hard towards the election.
Yeah, I think the focus is announced 2023, focus is the election, and let's work out what we need to do.
We're 2 years on from her resignation, and it's still there. There's still so much angst targeted towards her. Yeah,
I think there was a level of visceral hatred shown towards us and to Jacinda that was always, if it ever abates, it's going to be a long time before it does. That's it. I think a lot of people who were angry and frustrated in 2022 and maybe 2023 are not so much now, but there is a hard core for whom this has become sort of, I'd say a rallying call. It's not even that. They felt their anger was so deeply seated that they haven't been able to shake it off.
What's it seated in? Is it sexism? Is it tall poppyism?
Yeah, I think it's I mean, we've always been prone to that tall poppy thing. Well, you know, who does she think she is? I think that's it. I think There were some people who feel they lost their jobs as a consequence of her decisions, or even lost their businesses, and you suffer those losses. You go through those events in your life. You go through a grieving process. It's grief, and I think there was a sense for some people that, this was totally avoidable. And I think brought into, was there ever a pandemic? Was there ever a virus? Was any of this stuff necessary? And for people who are looking for answers and to be comforted because of the grief that's been caused to them, those are very easy messages to buy into. For some people, there was harm done, and it was deep-seated, and it continues. But I think the vast majority of New Zealanders, difficult as it may be, and inconvenienced as they may have been, in fact harmed as some may have been, they accept now that it happened, we got through it, and it's just now the process of rebuilding and putting life back together. For most people, most people don't want to hold on to the stuff that upsets them and distresses them.
Whichever way you look at it, a remarkable tenure to be governing.
Yeah, it was an incredible 6 years because of events outside her control, but also the issues political issues she chose to take on, and the things that we did, and a lot of the vitriol and hatred that is expressed, a lot of that was imported as well. It was the same stuff that was happening in other parts of the world. But I certainly, to this day, feel very privileged and honoured to have been part of that government, with all the challenges that we had, and on reflection, the things we could have done differently or better. But I still think it was an incredible time to be in government, and I feel very proud to have served under Jacinda.
Do you have any regrets?
I certainly still think there are things. I thought at the time there were some things we could have done better. Certainly on reflection, you think, that should have been done differently. But in the end, you're making these judgments and decisions, particularly these big calls around the pandemic. You're making them without all the relevant information, with imperfect information, and you make the best judgment call you can. And you're motivated by wanting to do the best, and wanting, in fact, to protect as many people as you can. So I think the motivations were honourable, even if some of the decisions we took and the things that happened were challenging for people.